Mercedes, BMW, and Audi, three of the most powerful names in global automotive history, just ghosted the American market overnight. No press tour, no warning. Just a cold, calculated retreat sparked by one policy. And when the headlines dropped, it wasn't just luxury that disappeared. It was billions in investments, tens of thousands of jobs, and a century of prestige gone like smoke. So what broke? Was this about tariffs or something deeper? Is luxury dying or just evolving? And what happens when the world's most trusted brands no longer trust us? This is the story no one expected, the unraveling no one's prepared for. Watch to the end, because the last chapter doesn't just explain what happened. Trump's tariff that tore it all down. The root of the explosion was no mystery. 4 weeks earlier, President Donald John Trump, deep into his second term, had published 12 words that upended the global auto industry. Typed late at night on Truth Social, the post read, "If you don't make it here, don't sell it here." That digital sentence, short and surgically precise, was followed by an executive order imposing a 200% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles and parts. There was no negotiation, no warning, no press conference, just a brutal policy detonated online and ratified in silence. The administration called it a restoration of economic sovereignty. The world saw it as economic warfare. The tariffs applied indiscriminately, whether a vehicle was made in Stuttgart or Seoul, whether it was a subcompact or a luxury SUV. German automakers, with their tightly integrated global supply chains and export-heavy business models, were hit the hardest. Trump's goal was clear: force manufacturing back onto American soil, or price foreign competition out of the market entirely. The strategy was rooted in a familiar promise from his first term: bring industry back home. But this time, the method wasn't symbolic, it was destructive. The tariffs immediately inflated the cost of production for any company operating globally. For companies like Mercedes, BMW, and Audi, which had long invested in U.S. operations but still relied on European and Asian components, it was a death sentence. While some Trump supporters hailed the move as a patriotic stand, others were stunned by its sudden scale and speed. Economists on both sides of the aisle warned of collateral damage, but the president remained defiant, declaring at a campaign rally, "We've been too nice for too long. Now we play hardball." The German automakers weren't unprepared. They simply couldn't withstand it. Why Mercedes, BMW, and Audi had no choice. The retreat was not a temper tantrum. It was math, and the numbers didn't lie. For decades, the German auto giants had built a profitable ecosystem in the United States, relying on a combination of local assembly and imported parts. Mercedes-Benz operated a flagship factory in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. BMW ran its largest plant in the world, out of Spartanburg, South Carolina. Audi, while smaller in American production, moved hundreds of thousands of imported vehicles through U.S. ports annually. But those American-made cars were not made entirely in America. The chassis might be assembled in Alabama, but the engine control unit came from Germany, the digital displays from Slovakia, the battery systems from South Korea. It was a ballet of international precision, one that worked beautifully until the Trump tariffs snapped the strings. A 200% tariff on foreign parts meant that even vehicles assembled in the United States now had component costs that made them financially untenable. Mercedes estimated that tariff costs on the GLS class SUV alone had increased by nearly $15,000 per unit. BMW's plug-in hybrids, already under margin pressure, were rendered unprofitable overnight. Audi's imported luxury sedans became showroom poison. The companies ran the models through every financial scenario available: component substitution, supplier reshuffling, price increases. But none of it worked. Either the vehicles became so expensive that no one would buy them, or the companies would bleed red ink on every sale. In internal board meetings, the conclusions were unanimous. Mercedes called it unsustainable. BMW labeled it strategically incompatible. Audi called it an extinction-level event. Even subsidies from state governments couldn't make up for the tariff wall erected by Washington. This wasn't a case of being unwilling to adapt. It was an industrial ambush. And for the German automakers, the only choice left was the nuclear one: full withdrawal. And the real tragedy? The Americans left behind. Stories like this don't make the evening news, but we make sure they reach you first. Subscribe now and drop a comment to tell us how this is playing out where you live. The American betrayal. Dealers left for dead. Across the country, the fallout landed like a bomb in slow motion. Mercedes-Benz dealerships in Los Angeles, Miami, and Houston once temples of luxury and customer service, received no advance notice. The press release hit social media before internal dealer memos could be sent. In Denver, a showroom manager was fielding a delivery of GLC models when a customer showed him the headline on their phone. By noon, sales lines were jammed not with inquiries, but with panic. Dealerships had spent decades building brand equity. Millions were invested in showroom renovations, staff training, and customer experience programs tailored specifically to the German brands. Franchisees, many of whom operated under long-term contracts with the manufacturers, were blindsided. Without new inventory, without factory support, without marketing pipelines, their businesses were effectively frozen in time. Floor models became museum pieces. Warranty questions flooded in. Customers demanded to know whether parts would still be available, whether financing packages were void, whether they should return their vehicles before it was too late. Service departments, arguably the backbone of most dealerships, were suddenly in limbo, without access to updated diagnostic tools, firmware patches, or certified replacement parts. Even routine maintenance became a challenge. Owners of newer vehicles were the most anxious, facing a future where a malfunctioning sensor could mean weeks of delay or complete inoperability. Some dealerships began laying off staff within 48 hours. Others closed entirely within weeks, unwilling to navigate the uncertainty. But it wasn't just business, it was betrayal. Dealership owners had been loyal partners, building the German brands in markets from Manhattan to Milwaukee. And now they were being left to collapse under the weight of decisions made an ocean away. Some dealership groups considered legal action, citing breach of contract. Others simply vented to local press, accusing the automakers of cowardice and the government of economic sabotage. In towns where these dealerships were economic anchors, the fallout was even more painful. Car washes, detailers, tire shops, and financing agents, small businesses that orbited around the prestige ecosystem, were cut adrift. The damage wasn't just commercial, it was deeply personal. This was the collapse of a local economic ecosystem, the unraveling of a fabric that took decades to weave. And Wall Street? They saw it coming. Wall Street's whiplash. Who cashed out first? Before the press releases hit the wires, before dealerships were notified, before employees were ushered into emergency town halls, a quiet sell-off had already begun. Wall Street insiders, those with enough connections to smell seismic shifts before they hit the surface, started moving. Shares of Daimler, AG, BMW Group, and Volkswagen AG began to show subtle volatility. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to raise eyebrows among those watching closely. By the time the public learned of the German exodus, the market had already partially adjusted. Traders who had hedged early against foreign automakers made millions. Analysts at investment banks quietly downgraded German auto stocks in the days leading up to the announcement, citing geopolitical uncertainty in vague terms. Meanwhile, domestic players like Ford and General Motors saw brief spikes in their share prices, as investors speculated that the absence of European luxury giants might create a rare window of competitive dominance. But the celebration on Wall Street was short-lived. What seemed like a boon quickly soured into concern. The broader implications of a trade war escalation made investors jittery. Supplier stocks tanked, especially companies that served multiple automakers across borders. Logistics companies, ports, and specialized component makers saw double-digit drops in market value. Hedge funds began shorting U.S. companies with deep European exposure, betting on the fallout to widen. Behind the scenes, there were whispers of insider trading, executives and well-connected financiers allegedly moving assets days before the tariffs were formally revealed. Regulatory bodies launched quiet investigations, but enforcement lagged behind the headlines. The game had already been played. The winners had already cashed out. Wall Street had turned a human tragedy into an algorithmic opportunity. But while the markets recalibrated, far from the trading floors, a quieter crisis began to take shape, one that threatened an entire generation's economic future. But while the markets shifted, a whole generation's future collapsed, the collapse of automotive education. For over 20 years, Southern colleges and technical institutes built their programs around the automotive manufacturing boom. Universities partnered directly with German automakers, designing entire curricula around drivetrain engineering, mechatronics, advanced robotics, and electric powertrain diagnostics. High school students in South Carolina were enrolling in vocational pipeline programs that promised six-figure careers before they were old enough to vote. The pathway was clear. The jobs were guaranteed. The future seemed bulletproof. Until it wasn't. When Mercedes, BMW, and Audi pulled the plug, that entire educational ecosystem collapsed almost overnight. Internships were canceled en masse. Cooperative learning programs with automakers vanished. Professors, some of whom were recruited from Germany to teach cutting-edge courses, found themselves teaching obsolete syllabi. Scholarship funds dried up. Engineering graduates suddenly discovered their degrees were calibrated for a workforce that no longer existed. Students who once dreamed of careers in automotive innovation now faced a bleak set of choices: relocate, retrain, or restart. Many chose none of the above. Dropout rates surged in technical programs across Alabama and South Carolina. Enrollment in automotive manufacturing tracks plummeted. Some community colleges began pivoting toward aerospace or renewable energy, trying to salvage resources and rebrand fast enough to remain relevant. But for many, the damage had already been done. The psychological toll was immense. Entire classes of students raised in households funded by Mercedes or BMW salaries were now told that the very industries they had prepared for were disappearing from their region. Faculty morale nosedived. Multi-million-dollar automotive training facilities sat empty. And while administrators scrambled to pivot, the one group they could not console was the students who had been promised futures that no longer existed. And that's when the workers stopped waiting and started fighting back. The labor uprising no one predicted. The first blockade appeared on Interstate 20. A line of freight trucks with German OEM parts refused to move, their drivers standing in front of rigs holding signs that read, "We built your cars. You don't get to walk away." Then came the walkouts. Not just at the factories, those were already being wound down, but at supplier warehouses, regional transport hubs, and even third-party logistics firms who had lost business overnight. Union organizers, long dormant in some southern states, suddenly found themselves at the center of a spontaneous uprising. Workers who had never attended a union meeting flooded into makeshift organizing halls. They weren't asking for better contracts. They were demanding accountability from companies, governors, and even the federal government. They blocked loading docks. They chained themselves to dealership doors. In Georgia, a supplier warehouse was occupied for 2 full days before state police arrived. What made the uprising unique wasn't just its ferocity, it was its direction. Workers were not just blaming the German automakers, they were blaming their own leaders. They targeted local politicians who had handed out tax incentives to foreign companies with no long-term exit protections. They demanded answers from state officials who had promised job security and decades of partnership. Even non-union white-collar workers joined the protests. Engineers, marketing staff, and dealership managers all stood shoulder to shoulder with factory floor employees. It wasn't about ideology, it was about betrayal. These weren't just jobs, these were lives, homes, and generational dreams that had been yanked away without warning. It was the kind of labor movement America hadn't seen in decades. Angry, organized, and laser-focused. And it wasn't going away. While workers rioted, Europe quietly prepared a counterstrike. Germany hits back and the world listens. Germany did not quietly retreat from the American market. It retaliated politically, diplomatically, and economically. Within 24 hours of the announcement that Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Audi would cease operations in the United States, the German government convened an emergency meeting in Berlin. Chancellor Annalena Baerbock stood before a crowded press corps and declared the move a direct consequence of what she called economic sabotage dressed up as patriotism. Behind closed doors, the European Union activated its trade response mechanisms, launching a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization and signaling its intention to challenge the legality of Trump's unilateral tariffs. What made this retaliation different was its coordination. Germany wasn't acting alone. It was backed by the full weight of the European Union. Trade envoys from Brussels began quietly reworking long-stalled agreements with other major economies, including Brazil, India, and Japan. Behind every handshake and press release was a not-so-subtle message. The transatlantic trade relationship could no longer be trusted. German automakers, once symbols of globalization, were now pawns in a much larger geopolitical chess match, and Europe had chosen to pivot east and south, away from Washington's erratic economic nationalism. Public statements from Berlin struck a tone of righteous indignation. Germany's finance minister lambasted the United States for weaponizing tariffs, calling the move a reckless provocation that undermines decades of post-war cooperation. The European Parliament echoed these sentiments with a resolution condemning the tariffs and expressing solidarity with the German companies impacted. This was not the language of retreat, it was the language of resistance, and the global press took notice. International editorials framed the German response as a pivotal moment, the end of American economic leadership and the beginning of a multipolar trade era. Europe had drawn a red line, and the message was clear. The cost of playing economic hardball with the EU had just skyrocketed. But Europe wasn't just pushing back with words. The next move made everything clear. They weren't coming back. China becomes the new luxury capital. If America had shut its doors, China flung theirs wide open. Within weeks of the German automaker's U.S. departure, Chinese officials met with executives from Daimler AG, BMW Group, and Audi in Shanghai. What followed was a flurry of signed memorandums, factory blueprints, and local government tax incentives. Germany's Big Three didn't just replace the United States market, they upgraded it, at least in terms of political stability and growth potential. New manufacturing facilities were announced in the Guangdong province, with construction slated to begin within 6 months. These plants weren't just assembly lines, they were hubs for research, software development, and regional strategy. BMW's announcement of a flagship design studio in Chengdu symbolized a broader shift in branding. No longer was China just a sales target. It was now the cultural and creative heartbeat of the premium automotive industry. What fueled this realignment wasn't just economic logic, it was also emotional exhaustion. After years of unpredictable US policy swings, trade wars, and last-minute tariff threats, Germany's automakers had grown tired of playing defense. China, by contrast, offered consistency. While its political system was authoritarian, its industrial policy was ruthlessly reliable for companies that needed 10-year forecasts and billion-dollar investment timelines that mattered more than Washington's ideological volatility. The consumer base in China had also matured. The old stereotype of buyers craving flashy status symbols was outdated. Chinese luxury consumers were now younger, tech-savvy, and interested in sustainable mobility and connected ecosystems. German automakers tailored their offerings accordingly. New electric sedans with biometric startup systems, AI-assisted parking, and integrated ride-sharing features. The silent winner in all of this was Beijing. While the West argued over tariffs and nationalism, China welcomed the future of luxury on its own terms. However, shifting location meant shifting identity inside the reinvention of German prestige. With their American legacy cut short, the German luxury giants faced a daunting challenge. How do you reinvent a brand that was once defined by its dominance in the United States? The answer wasn't found in nostalgia. It was forged through innovation, agility, and rebranding on a global scale. Mercedes-Benz introduced its New Legacy campaign across Europe and Asia, emphasizing a future built on electric power, sustainability, and digital integration. The S-Class was no longer the flagship. It was a platform, a software-driven luxury node in a connected lifestyle. BMW, meanwhile, retooled its branding to emphasize emotion and experience. No longer fixated solely on performance, the company launched its Feel Electric initiative, blending driver feedback with biofeedback systems and real-time personalization. Gone were the traditional ad campaigns that featured winding roads and leather interiors. Instead, viewers saw smart cities, wellness dashboards, and urban autonomy. BMW wasn't selling cars anymore. It was selling the promise of seamless movement through an intelligent, premium future. Audi took a different path. Leaning into its reputation for clean design and precision engineering, it launched the Beyond the Drive project, a fully digital loyalty ecosystem that rewarded customers with real-world perks, exclusive hotel access, concert partnerships, and even co-branded EV charging lounges. The brand was transforming from automaker to lifestyle enabler. In this post-US identity, German automakers no longer had to conform to American expectations. They were free to build new definitions of luxury, tailored to emerging markets and evolving value systems. Still, for all the global success, something felt missing. Back in the United States, loyal fans didn't see these companies as renewed. They saw them as vanished. But for American fans, the brand didn't evolve. It disappeared. The rise of underground car culture. Across the United States, garages lit up late into the night. Not with corporate logos or dealership lights, but with socket wrenches, LED headlamps, and YouTube tutorials. A new underground movement had begun. Owners of Mercedes, BMWs, and Audis, now orphaned by their manufacturers, banded together in online forums and backyard repair shops. They weren't just maintaining their cars, they were preserving their legacy. DIY repair culture exploded. Communities pooled resources to import parts, share diagnostic tricks, and even translate German language service manuals. Enthusiast networks formed ad hoc distribution systems for rare components, from M-series control arms to AMG exhaust valves. Facebook groups with names like Audi After America and Loyal to the Three gained tens of thousands of members. To own one of these vehicles after the exit was to be part of a brotherhood, bonded by pride and grit. Some took it further. Tuners and custom builders began modifying these vehicles into unique works of art. Without brand warranties or official oversight, creativity took the wheel. Retrofitted electric drivetrains, handmade body kits, and hacked infotainment systems transformed once standard sedans into statement machines. A Mercedes CLA that once blended into suburban lots now roared with a Tesla motor and a custom fabricated grille. In a way, the departure of German automakers hadn't killed the culture, it had made it personal. But this renaissance was out of necessity. Many owners had no choice but to maintain their vehicles independently. Without corporate service centers or official parts pipelines, traditional ownership gave way to self-sufficiency. Extended warranties meant less. Manufacturer updates stopped arriving. What had once been a luxury turned into a labor of love. Yet within that loss was something raw and defiant. This wasn't a retreat. It was a reinvention on American soil. The rise of underground car culture turned every garage into a sanctuary, and every loyalist into a curator of German automotive heritage. While the market wrestled with that identity shift, the private sector was already rethinking something much bigger than tariffs. They were rethinking America itself, corporate America's new fear, U.S. instability. For decades, the United States had been seen as the safest major market in the world. Stable politics, predictable rules, business-friendly regulations. But the sudden exit of three of Europe's most powerful automakers shattered that illusion. And inside corporate boardrooms across the globe, a single question began to take root. Is the United States still a safe place to do business? Multinational companies began reassessing their American footprints, not out of ideology, but out of necessity. What had once been long-term strategic expansion was now being reconsidered through a different lens. Risk, political volatility, sudden regulatory reversals, and unpredictable trade barriers were no longer theoretical concerns. They had become operational threats. Internal risk committees at Fortune 500 firms began initiating scenario stress tests, mapping what a similar tariff episode might look like in sectors like pharmaceuticals, tech, and aerospace. Financial institutions added new variables to their lending models, accounting for policy-driven revenue volatility. Foreign firms began redlining the U.S. in board meetings, not as a place to avoid altogether, but as a region that now required higher buffers, shorter commitment windows, and stricter legal safeguards. At the same time, whispers of friend whoring grew louder. Instead of bringing business to America, companies looked to partner with countries whose regulatory systems were less volatile and whose geopolitical strategies were more consistent. Canada, Australia, Japan, and even Vietnam started appearing more frequently on expansion maps. It was not just a tariff crisis, it was a confidence crisis. And for a country that had long branded itself as the beating heart of global capitalism, That perception shift was nothing short of existential. And beneath all of this, beneath the policy debates, the corporate hedging, the consumer confusion, something deeper was dying. What just died, and what comes next? The German automaker exodus didn't just kill a trade deal, it killed an idea. The idea that global markets were forever, that international commerce, once established, was permanent, that if you built trust over decades, invested in communities, sponsored universities, hired locally, and obeyed the rules, you would never be shown the door. That illusion is now gone. What died in that moment was the myth of market permanence. Mercedes-Benz had been in the United States for over 60 years. BMW's plant in South Carolina was the largest it had anywhere in the world. Audi had invested billions into technology partnerships and EV rollouts. And yet, with a single tariff order, all of it collapsed. Globalization, once hailed as the inevitable evolution of capitalism, now looked fragile. It could be disrupted not by war, not by economic collapse, but by a tweet and a press conference. A new era had begun, one defined not by global integration, but by economic walls, sovereign markets, and volatile leadership. For consumers, the change felt immediate, but for corporations, the psychological shift may last generations. Risk models will evolve. Political forecasting will become a core competency. Expansion plans will carry escape clauses. The world did not stop trading, but it stopped trusting. As for the automakers, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Audi will survive. They will innovate. They will thrive in Asia, in Europe, and across the Middle East. But they will remember what happened here, not as a chapter in their US story, but as a cautionary tale about the fragility of even the most established relationships. And in America, the highways will echo with different engines. The dealerships will carry different badges. The consumer will adapt. But the era that just ended, the era of assumed global presence, of German luxury on American roads, will not return. What just vanished wasn't luxury, it was certainty. If this story hit you like it hit us, subscribe for more truth they won't put in the headlines. And tell us in the comments, was this a necessary reset or a catastrophic betrayal?